Welcome to the first Wicked book summary and analysis. After reading the book A Father's Story by Jeffrey Dahmer's father, Lionel Dahmer, I knew I had to share it with you. We know Jeffrey Dahmer, but let's try to understand Lionel. One of the most notorious criminals in modern history, Jeffrey Dahmer shocked the world when he was convicted of 16 slayings. Jeffrey evaded capture for over a decade while claiming victims under a haunting compulsion. This story details the traumatic unfolding from the perspective of Lionel Dahmer, based on his memoir. Through Lionel's eyes, we witness in a grim narrative his son's descent into darkness despite a father's desperate love. Lionel Dahmer remembers when his wife Joyce was pregnant with Jeffrey, her condition worsening physically and emotionally. The severe morning sickness persists, and Joyce develops mysterious, rigid seizures where her body tremors and she froths at the mouth. Multiple medications provide little relief. Lionel feels helpless, unable to relieve Joyce's suffering or give her the emotional support she needs. Lionel focuses on practical provisions like food and shelter rather than affection. But this proves insufficient for Joyce. Arguments flare up, revealing a rift in the marriage. They move to Lionel's parents' house in hopes the situation will improve. Lionel splits his time between caring for Joyce and pursuing his chemistry graduate studies. He frequently leaves his increasingly isolated, angry, and distressed wife alone with his parents. But Lionel feels limited in how he can help, bound by his dutiful nature and lack of emotional skill. Joyce's decline continues unchecked. After a difficult pregnancy, Joyce finally gives birth to their son Jeffrey. Initially there is joy, with Lionel noting how much the newborn resembles him. But the happiness quickly fades. Problems resurface within days of bringing Jeffrey home, centering around difficulties with nursing. Joyce struggles with nursing and quickly gives it up, finding her breast to dry up the milk. Tension rises in the cramped bedroom shared with Lionel's parents. Arguments flare up between Joyce and Lionel's mother. Joyce often withdraws, refusing to join the family for meals. Lionel feels baffled by Joyce's emotional problems, unable to understand her childhood traumas. As an analytical thinker, he believes she should simply move past any fears or cruelty she experienced growing up. But his perspective fails to comprehend Joyce's deeper wounds and complex psyche. Arguments continue between Joyce and Lionel as well, with Joyce sometimes fleeing the house in distress. Lionel escapes to his work in the lab, leaving Joyce frequently alone and isolated. Though living under the same roof, a gulf widens between them. After 4 months, Lionel and Joyce move with baby Jeffrey to their own apartment, hoping for relief from tension. For a time, life improves somewhat, but the underlying marital strains persist in mixtures of good and bad times. Lionel describes moving with Joyce and their young son Jeffrey to university housing for Lionel's chemistry PhD program. Lionel enjoys the orderly world of lab research, where he understands the governing laws. But outside the lab, navigating his strained marriage leaves Lionel feeling far less certain. Joyce sinks into deterioration at home, with little baby Jeffrey having to clean their filthy new house herself. Arguments and even violence flares up between the couple. But there are good times too, when the family enjoys parades and other outings. As Jeffrey grows up, he remains a happy child who adores his father, but he falls frequently ill with infections. The regular clinic injections leave his little behind covered in bumps, and Jeffrey grows fearful of the doctors. On a bike ride, Lionel and Jeffrey discover an injured baby bird, feeding it milk through a bottle. Together they nurse it back to health at home, and finally the day comes to release the grown bird into the bright spring outdoors. Lionel recalls Jeffrey being so happy in this moment. However, it's not long before Lionel notices some of his son's odd interests. Lionel recalls his own childhood obsession with fire, striking matches and watching the flames. This fascination goes unknown to his father until Lionel nearly burns down a neighbor's garage, prompting a stern lecture on controlling dangerous impulses. Years later, living in Iowa, Lionel detects a terrible smell under the house. He finds a small pile of bones left by preying animals. Lionel gathers the remains to eliminate the odor. 4-year-old Jeffrey sits fascinated as he rattles the bones, likening them to fiddlesticks. Lionel now views this incident with foreboding, unable to separate it from his son's future atrocities. He questions the meaning of other childhood episodes. Were they ordinary childish curiosity or early warnings of darkness? Seeking to cultivate his son's interest in science, Lionel takes Jeffrey to his university chemistry lab. But Jeffrey seems indifferent, merely enjoying a day out with his dad. Nothing captivates him like the animal bones once did. In the following year, 5-year-old Jeffrey's play takes on definite patterns as he continues to grow. He prefers games of stalking and concealment over physical play. Meanwhile, consumed with finishing his PhD, Lionel barely notices the changes in his young son. Then suddenly, Jeffrey is stricken with a hernia requiring surgery. The recovery is slow and painful, leaving Jeffrey subdued and vulnerable, sinking into himself. As Lionel rushes past, he fails to notice the light going out in his son's eyes. Jeffrey starts first grade, but does so reluctantly and fearfully. He has become deeply shy and distant, dreading interactions with other people as if expecting harm from them. This stark change in demeanor alarms Lionel, remembering the once happy and self-assured boy Jeffrey used to be. When Lionel meets with Jeffrey's teacher a month later, she confirms his extreme shyness and solitude, merely going through the motions in class without interest or engagement. On the playground, Jeffrey paces by himself, avoiding other children entirely. While disturbing to Lionel, he believes Jeffrey's behavior stems largely from their abrupt move to an unfamiliar place. Recalling his severe childhood shyness, Lionel sees his son as struggling to adapt, desiring predictability and structure instead of change. Though troubling, Lionel does not view Jeffrey's flaw as insurmountable. Further action is still needed, however. So Lionel takes hope from the teacher's assurance she will work to integrate Jeffrey into the school community. Recalling his own childhood insecurities and social awkwardness, Lionel sympathizes with Jeffrey's similar struggles. Though plagued by feelings of inadequacy and a dread of the confusing world around him, Lionel managed an outwardly normal adulthood in education, career, and family. He believes Jeffrey can also learn to cope and overcome in time. In retrospect, however, Lionel sees Jeffrey's condition was more severe, bordering on total isolation and gripped by perversity. Lionel wonders if there were visible signs he should have recognized, if he could have intervened before darker forces consumed his son. One memory stands out, finding a terrified Jeffrey trapped in mud, sobbing uncontrollably. When Lionel rescues him, Jeffrey clings to his father joyfully, relief flooding his being. Perhaps young Jeffrey thought Lionel could always save him from distress. But the most endangered part remained invisible. Lionel only saw the shy, withdrawn tendencies resembling his own, even taking some comfort in their similarity as father and son. At age 7, they move again, to Barberton, presumably further disorienting the ever-change adverse Jeffrey. But to Lionel, change brings necessary life lessons. So Jeffrey must find his own way of dealing. A new location brings new growth. Joy is pregnant again with another boy. Lionel is concerned for his wife's mental health as he watches her struggle. With a new baby brother and Joy's descending into severe postpartum depression, Lionel shoulders more domestic duties, attending worship services with Jeffrey less frequently. Still, pleasant memories remain. Morning walks for eggs with Jeffrey and his beloved dog Frisky, Saturday ice cream outings. When they move to Barberton, 5-month-old Dave sleeps while Jeffrey rides numbly and back, his emotions flatlining into a passive resignation. But flashes of his former playful self sometimes emerge, like when playing in their backyard. He soon befriends a neighbor. That Halloween, costumed as devils, the two go trick-or-treating together. All smiles in a photograph with no hint of Jeffrey's impending descent. In a rare reach beyond the family, 8-year-old Jeffrey develops an unexplained fondness for a kind third-grade teacher's assistant. Perhaps perceiving his isolation and trouble, she extended basic warmth which deeply affected Jeffrey. Though unable to recall details, to Lionel this shows his son's capability to respond and connect. Jeffrey even gives her a bowl of tadpoles, caught while they played and bonded outdoors. As Lionel considers his own early sexual awakening through comic book fantasies, he wonders if Jeffrey's darker compulsions first stirred around ages 9 to 10. Though Jeffrey claims 14 for his first sexual fantasies, Lionel notices worrisome changes much earlier. Between 10 to 15 years old, Jeffrey's physical carriage grows oddly rigid and tense. His legs lock stiffly at the knees, feet dragging. Shyness intensifies into nervous energy around others, grasping sticks or grass with winding fingers. At home, Jeffrey blanks out for hours before the TV or wanders aimlessly, humorless and disengaged. Lionel tries engaging his solitary son's interests, attempting soccer, tennis, archery, and scouting, but nothing sticks for long. At 15, withdrawn, Jeffrey abandons everything Lionel introduced him to, losing even casual interests. Unlike Lionel's own boyhood, Jeffrey reads little beyond assigned schoolwork, showing no curiosity for music, art, or other people. Hoping to boost shy Jeffrey's confidence, as it had his own, Lionel suggests bodybuilding. Jeffrey eagerly takes to the bull worker Lionel buys him, intensely dedicated for almost a year before it too gets abandoned. To Lionel, these discarded interests, like Jeffrey himself, epitomize an irrecoverable loss, the engaged son who could have been. Instead, teenage Jeffrey secretly pursues darker fascinations, as Lionel horrifyingly learns much later. Jeffrey roams their neighborhood on bike with bags, collecting animal remains to strip, mount, and memorialize. Outwardly, Jeffrey grows only more passive, solitary, and unexpressive. He forms no relationships beyond convenience and conveys no ambitions, as if believing he has no future. Lionel recognizes only his son's increasing inwardness and disconnection, unaware of the unspeakable compulsions overwhelming Jeffrey within. Without erratic behavior as a warning sign, the quiet descent into madness claims not just Jeffrey, but his innocent victims as well. By the late 1970s, Lionel and Joyce's strained marriage disintegrates after her ongoing physical and mental decline. Joyce develops numerous illnesses, insomnia, violently shaking episodes, causing days of bedridden exhaustion. Though medical tests find no cause, she is diagnosed with anxiety and briefly psychiatrically hospitalized twice. Attending group therapy provides no relief through new friendships, creative pursuits selling crafts, and whimsically chasing a UFO. But the reprieve doesn't last. Joyce withdraws again as weight issues persist despite thyroid medication. Their social life evaporates. Still, the marriage flickers with hope during sporadic improvements in Joyce's condition. Overall, however, Joyce's grip on reality loosens through the years. She believes a demon with red eyes peers through a basement window and makes several odd references to lions before becoming obsessed with purported lion attacks. Fleeing the house one night panicked. Her emotional extremes disturb teenage Jeffrey, already struggling inwardly. As their divorce finalizes, Lionel moves to a motel while Joyce and their son remain in the family home. Emotionally depleted at 42, feeling he wasted years in his doomed marriage, Lionel meets a new woman named Sherry. Also divorced and lonely, they quickly bond in their vulnerability. They differ greatly in emotional temperament, however. Lionel more detached and analytical, oblivious to interpersonal issues. Lionel and Sherry hope to make a home with 18-year-old Jeffrey, who seems glad for their presence. But soon Sherry discovers Jeffrey drunk amidst liquor bottles in his room, claiming boredom drove his drinking binge. Lionel, shocked at this unknown issue, angrily lectures Jeffrey to no reaction. Weeks later, 2 of Sherry's rings mysteriously disappear from their bedroom. Police trace the thefts to one of Jeffrey's friends, but Jeffrey denies any knowledge, insulted by the accusations. Sherry glimpses at a terrifying flash of rage in Jeffrey's eyes. Lionel meticulously enrolls Jeffrey in technical college, even paying before learning he never attended a single class. Hoping college marks a fresh start, Lionel's wishful thinking shatters against Jeffrey's disastrous first quarter. Failing courses, minimal credits, distinguishing only in riflery. Jeffrey claims getting a temp job took priority. One truth among the lies. While disturbed, Lionel clings to the belief his wayward son remains essentially harmless. A picture of Jeffrey's college drinking problem also emerges, daily drinking to blackout states, even selling blood plasma to fund his supply, barred for overuse. Sensing the unhealthy dynamic, Lionel moves out with Sherry, but keeps paying the house bills. Jeffrey continues declining, drunkenly smashing his car before entering treatment. After a temporary release home, his merely stalled addiction rages again. Following another heated confrontation, Lionel forbids Jeffrey from returning. Now completely disowned by his parents, Jeffrey descends rapidly over the year into full-blown alcoholism and utter isolation. Dropping out of college, he is arrested for drunken disorderly conduct. Lionel rationalizes the dropped-out Jeffrey's lifelessness as merely youthful aimlessness, and an alcohol-soaked brain. In hindsight, college and careers must have seemed alien notions to someone whose inner world fixated solely on a grisly murder fantasy endlessly replayed. Lionel's values utterly incomprehensible against the backdrop of Jeffrey's inconceivable acts. But tragically oblivious to the darkness consuming his son from within, Lionel knew absolutely nothing of what Jeffrey had done. Presented with work or military as his only options now, Jeffrey job hunts from the mall, where Lionel drops him off, sometimes clearly drunk by afternoon. One day Lionel refuses to retrieve an utterly plastered Jeffrey, demanding he sober up first before calling for a ride. But Jeffrey never calls. At 10 p.m., Lionel returns to find the closed mall empty. His son vanished into the night. With no options left, Lionel delivers a resigned Jeffrey to enlist, hoping the rigid structure benefits him. Initially, it seems a miraculous transformation. After 6 months, Jeffrey returns tidy and clear-eyed, cheerfully helping around the house. The emboldened son waves goodbye to the military, apparently saved by the uniform and what it represents. Lionel selectively believes reports of Jeffrey enjoying his tour, ignoring the occasional clipped, wary tone. Then abruptly, Jeffrey's belongings arrive, discharged months earlier without explanation, beyond coded alcoholism. No forwarding location or contact either. Once again, Lionel is left grasping to understand his vanishing son suddenly gone without a trace. After fleeing discharged and broke from the military, Jeffrey calls happily from Miami, supposedly working at a sub shop. Conversations remain clipped, but Lionel hopes the distance spurs independence. That hope dies when a now destitute Jeffrey asks for money. They send only a ticket home. Though filthy and drunk, Jeffrey seems cheerful initially, eagerly helping around the house. But soon arrested for violent drunkenness, Jeffrey spirals downward into alcohol abuse. Lionel and Sherry hit their limit, checking Jeffrey into detox. With no way to trust him alone at home or with the car, they have to make an agonizing decision. Jeffrey has become like a black hole, sucking in all light, energy, and emotion around him. He clearly needs full-time professional help. But how can they manage that financially? Hoping for the best, Lionel sends Jeffrey to live with his grandmother in Wisconsin. Over the next hopeful 6 years, Jeffrey seems to thrive, helping around the house, attending church, and holding a job. Lionel encourages him to pursue a romantic interest at church. But gradually his regression resurfaces. Lionel's mother confides disturbing details to Sherry, rather than burden Lionel about his son. Like finding a full-sized mannequin stashed in Jeffrey's closet. Challenged on it, Jeffrey calmly claims he stole it on impulse to prove he could. To Lionel, it is an inconsequential prank. But to Sherry, the incident reveals something deeply wrong, demanding examination rather than excuses. But ominous cracks penetrate the facade. A powerful handgun stored underneath Jeffrey's bed. Unexplained weekend disappearances. Once when startled on the stairs, Jeffrey bizarrely warns his grandmother he's not dressed, despite seeming so shortly after with a random drunk man in tow. As the troubling reports accumulate, Lionel's patience frays. During a heated exchange, Jeffrey chillingly threatens to spike Lionel's drink, revealing the pure malice cloaked behind his blank expression. Still, Lionel resists surrendering all hope, yearning for a path to recover the son entangled in darkness. More bizarre incidents challenge Lionel's determined denial. Horrible garage odors, first blamed on cats, then chemicals, finally admitting to a rotting raccoon carcass brought home to randomly experiment on. As Lionel questions the pointless strangeness, Jeffrey sticks to his ludicrous story. Another time, Lionel directly confronts his evasive son about possible illegalities with the pistol. But he always allows himself to ultimately accept Jeffrey's excuses, admitting his son clearly has a darker side. Lionel avoids considering how far it could go. He grasps desperately at any hope while evading unpleasant truths about Jeffrey. The harmless line Lionel assumes in his son is revealed as tragically wishful thinking. Now living alone, 31-year-old Jeffrey immediately lures a 13-year-old boy to his apartment with money for photos. Drugging, then taking advantage of the boy, Jeffrey is soon arrested when the victim flees and reports to police. Hearing the news, Lionel is outraged. Going through the motions, he arranges legal defense and bail, though entirely disconnected from comprehending Jeffrey's state of mind. The reality of his son utterly unrecognizable from the one enshrined in memory. Jeffrey minimizes the assault when released, claiming not to know the boy's age, and the genital contact was inadvertent. Lionel largely accepts his son's standard excuses, their relationship now avoiding any substantive exchange. On the eve of Jeffrey's sentencing for the inappropriate contact with the boy, Lionel demands to see the contents of a locked box left in the home. Tempers flare until Jeffrey promises to open it in the morning, only to show explicit magazines. But later, Lionel learned that while on bail, Jeffrey had killed yet another human being, and that box he'd refused to open had contained a human head. As the troubling reports mount over months, the fantasy of Jeffrey's rehabilitation unravels. From cruelly kicking ducks to ominously acquiring a freezer, the darkness reemerges. Each chilling incident chips away at the preserved image of Lionel's son. Lionel believes external forces beyond himself must intercede, the state, counseling, God, but still he clings to alcoholism as the core issue, the last foothold that his son might be saved. Released after 10 months despite Lionel's dire warnings, he soon gets a probation-approved apartment. When Lionel visits, he notices an odd oversized freezer. Jeffrey claims it's to supposedly stock up on sales, and Lionel approves of the thrifty practicality. Revisiting with younger son Dave at Christmas, Lionel now finds an extensive surveillance setup, ostensibly to deter neighborhood crime. Jeffrey seems settled, if over-fortified. While they're together, Lionel films an apparently cheerful, collected Jeffrey, speaking of aquarium fish and playing with the cat. But in retrospect, Lionel detects subtle signs of concealed anxiety. Behind Jeffrey's pleasant facade, the vice of madness still grips his son. About a year later, a terrifying call from Jeffrey's probation officer reveals his Jeffrey is accused of gruesomely killing 15 young men and boys. In those bewildering moments, Lionel fears only the worst fate for his son, but the unspeakable reality that his beloved child is in fact the unfathomable perpetrator defies all comprehension. Lionel Dahmer begins by imagining how he would have reacted if the police had told him his son Jeffrey is murdered, rather than his son is the murderer. He admits he would have mourned Jeffrey and demanded justice. But instead, Jeffrey's still alive, and Lionel is forced to confront the horrific crimes Jeffrey has committed. Jeffrey has acted entirely alone and in secret. The police thus reveal that some essential human quality is missing in Jeffrey, the voice of conscience that cries out, "Stop!" Lionel faces the profound reality that this capacity for empathy seems to have died or never existed within his son. In this fog, Lionel is woefully unprepared when police arrive with horrifying Polaroids found in Jeffrey's apartment. 13 snapshots of dismembered bodies and skulls send Lionel reeling, the reality of his son utterly unrecognizable from the one enshrined in memory. Lionel allows himself to believe that although Jeff might be implicated in a homicide, he is not the actual murderer. He accepts the fact that perhaps someone has indeed been killed in Jeff's apartment, but Lionel insists that his son may not have committed the murder. Perhaps Jeff has been framed or set up. Perhaps all the evidence against him is merely circumstantial. Lionel thinks that Jeff has only found the bodies by accident. He has been hurled into the center of a series of murders with which he has had nothing to do with. Desperately, Lionel tries to envision his son in the role of victim, someone who has gotten ensnarled in a net of terrible circumstances. Further details remain frustratingly scarce for hours. His attorney Boyle ominously reveals dismembered body parts of multiple victims discovered in Jeffrey's apartment, their IDs also present. As Lionel strains to comprehend Boyle's fragmented account, he is equally stunned anyone interacting with Jeffrey detected no clues beforehand. Breaking the news to his wife, Sherry, even the word homicide eludes her stunned denial. Like Lionel, she can only conceive of passive Jeffrey as a potential suicide victim, not calculated monster. So when Lionel calls his mother to convey Jeffrey's latest trouble, he is shocked to hear police are simultaneously raiding her home. Every TV channel blazes with the gruesome story. Reporters hound Lionel ruthlessly. Though visiting Jeffrey in prison as duty-bound, Lionel otherwise distances himself from connecting with his son's unfathomable darkness. Lionel plunges into despair over Jeffrey's monstrous acts. Robbed of denial's refuge, Lionel is crushed by waves of guilt and anguish for the families destroyed by his evil son. Seeing no escape from blame or reminders with Jeffrey permanently famous for atrocious wrongs, Lionel asks how to press on shouldering the unshakable burden. Seeing Jeffrey's face blink at the news, Lionel grasps the abrupt loss of their private identities. They are public pariahs now, inextricably tied to an infamous predator, sharing their name and fate. It is a surreal portal into unfathomable darkness that will haunt Lionel and Sherry eternally. As facts unravel in cascading reports, the emerging portrait of the secret psycho killer defies all they believed of their son. Over days of anguished absorption, the scope of Jeffrey's horrific violations mount, 15 murdered in unspeakable ways. Lionel descends into a personal hell during the media's feeding frenzy, with his entire existence defined by his mass killer son. There seems no escaping his living nightmare. He awakens to guard his fragile mother, now under media siege, thanks to her grandson's horrors. Slipping past the encamped press, Lionel finds his dazed mother unable to reconcile her memory of thin, pale Jeffrey with the dynamic killer depicted. Still mentally blocking the full truth, she takes comfort in this illusion of weakness proving his innocence. Lionel gently tells her nothing can exonerate Jeffrey now. He is in jail, awaiting trial for gruesome offenses she must accept despite the anguish. They talk through the tears of what was lost. He kisses her goodnight, his heart aching over the pain brought to her doorstep. Though the frenzied pack of reporters roiled his mother's lawn eventually dispersed, their intrusion resumes that night with eggs pelting her home. Calling police while comforting his baffled mother, Lionel rinses away the mess. Lionel reviews Jeffrey's graphic confession conveyed by the lawyer. The extreme cruelty and violation detailed horrifies Lionel. He despairs over ever comprehending Jeffrey's motivation for such depraved acts only Satan could design. Struggling to process the sickening revelations, through his shocked numbness, Lionel reflexively immerses himself in familiar work to keep functioning. He desperately clings to any thread allowing denial. The crime's circumstantial. Jeffrey merely stumbled on bodies already dead. But deep down, Lionel knows the dire truth approaches relentlessly. Mostly Lionel dreads the personal exposure tied to his now infamous deviant son, their lives inseparably linked in chaos and shame. He delays facing the grim reality as long as possible through endless tasks. But finally, Lionel braces to depart for Milwaukee. Arriving the next morning, Lionel first visits the probing police, who grill him for hours about his son, seeking clues to the motive behind Jeffrey's vicious torture slangs. His lawyer Boyle asks Lionel to stand united beside him at an upcoming press conference. But Lionel recoils, still clinging to his last shreds of privacy against the encroaching spotlight. Unable to publicly support his deviant son before the world, Lionel instead sleeps through Boyle's press conference while under his friend's roof. A vital piece of Lionel is still clinging to the vanished boy who laughed joyfully skating, resisting death's darker incarnation. Lionel and Sherry arrive for Jeffrey's sensational trial. The armed encampment reflects the perpetrator's global notoriety more than the timid loner they know. It is a surreal disconnect Lionel cannot reconcile. They take assigned seats with victims' grieving families nearby, wearing faces of unbridled hatred and disgust for the Dahmers. Jeffrey enters, looking depressed and ashamed. Despite months of numbing clinical analysis, Lionel notices his son's embarrassed avoidance of eye contact, as if their relationship retains some meaningful dynamic. Perhaps in subtle gesture, a flicker of humanity persists. In statements, Jeffrey dispassionately details his procedures for soliciting, drugging, violating, slaying, and dismembering his victims with tools of destruction. His detached recounting freezes blood, the depths of cruelty and madness fully catalogued through words and evidence, the awful display of grisly Polaroid evidence spanning Jeffrey's violations. Despite steeling himself, the hideous sight savages Lionel's soul. Severed limbs, and desecrated torsos in obscene disarray. Lionel's treasured little boy is dead, erased by the monster he has spawned, wearing the same face. Every shred of Lionel's preserved innocence dies under the Polaroid's merciless glare. These gruesome images irrefutably expose the monster behind Jeffrey's vacant eyes. To escape the graphic accounts, overwhelmed, Lionel walks out on the third day. He cannot absorb or reconcile the testimony's proof, the caring father's fantasy forever crushed. Struggling to incorporate each graphic revelation as the trial methodically advances, Lionel strains to conceptualize the person described sharing his blood. The extreme carnage remains in his mind, perpetrated by an unrecognizable stranger unrelated to him. He attends the proceedings as an impartial observer, separated from personal implications. Overnight, Lionel ages exponentially, the living effects of mass murder clearly carved upon his features the next day. Boyle asserts psychiatric evaluation as the only course to determine if treatment might ever penetrate his madness. Lionel accepts his unavoidable recommendation to pursue an insanity plea for the unfathomable Jeffrey. Lionel wholeheartedly agrees. Jeffrey is irrefutably insane and desperately needs help, not legal release. A disturbing motif also arises, a fixation on the predominance of African American victims as indication of racial targeting. To exhausted Lionel, this conjecture absolutely misreads his ill son's internal calculus. Jeffrey simply craved masculine male bodies as sexual outlets, upon which to release his disturbed compulsions. Their particular race was incidental, but the mistaken perception brings angry attention. Together, grieving privately, Lionel and Sherry endure the painful aftermath, essentially alone, but for a few friends steadfast. They determine not to watch the upcoming preliminary hearing, too drained to witness Jeffrey's further shaming. But the attorney Boyle convinces Lionel that his presence shows necessary support. Lionel is excluded from Jeffrey's defense, but expected to pose as the facade of a loyal father. At the trial, when the verdict rejects Jeffrey's insanity plea to find him fully accountable on all murder charges, Lionel and Sherry sit wordlessly amid the erupting courtroom in glimmers of humanity. The victims' families have conveyed sympathy, accepting the Dahmers' sorrow, despite a seemingly supportive presence. But things unravel quickly as survivors unleash anguish during sentencing statements, demanding to know whose side the Dahmers are on. Lionel professes compassion for all families, yet remains helpless to defend his son. Lionel's original childlike love now dead. Now with trial concluded and 15 life sentences handed out without parole, a quick anguished goodbye and Lionel hands over Jeffrey's clothes in plastic custody. The trial's speedy yet crushing and ushers confusion. The circus folds its tents as abruptly as it emerged. Lionel expects gradual normalization in the dispersing limelight, but descends into personal darkness instead. Hounded by the ubiquitous portrait of Jeffrey as a soulless ghoul, Lionel consents to media interviews, portraying glimpses of Jeffrey's once innocent childhood. He asserts that he does not support his son, but only that they have a blood relation. It is a complicated stance taken, given the public glare. Perhaps no possible position adequately reconciles such opposing truths. In a televised interview, Lionel asserts responsibility for his son's disturbing violations, but resists forgiveness. Shock turns to outrage as baseless media accusations smear both his wife and himself. An outlet labeled Sherry as an evil stepmother, while an anonymous source blames early sexual abuse by Lionel for unleashing Jeffrey's demons. Though categorically denied by both, Dahmer's doubts persist, straining Lionel's name, feeling branded as an abuser from the public. Real or imagined, paranoia consumes Lionel at his long-term research job. Lionel is fatally tainted by association of his son. He is recategorized against his will as a creator of atrocity rather than fellow victim. His working relationships crumble from the enduring trauma. Exiled in profound isolation, Lionel's path narrows as repeated setbacks accumulate. His last anchor severed with his aged mother's death 6 months after the trial, opting to forgo the burial's pain. Lionel was barred from the funeral, the family ties fully ruptured. Utterly alone in the world, Lionel has only the loyalty of his son. In retrospect, Lionel sees he obscured and minimized every red flag over the years, until each transgression turned catastrophic. But surely now, in the aftermath of multiple murders, Lionel will confront the stark reality without blinkers or excuses. Yet, even as gruesome revelations cascade from the investigation, a subconscious blockade stunts Lionel's absorption. He avoids probing details, needing shields to preserve remnant of his former life and son. A childhood incident emerges in Lionel's memory, attempting to hypnotize a little girl in order to control her actions utterly. Though told lightly before, Lionel now sees the event's darker drive to counter his own chronic sense of weakness and inferiority by seizing dominance externally. Perhaps had Lionel confronted flaws fostering those fraying needs for control, instead of denying internal gaps, both father and son might have quelled frustration differently before it consumed Jeffrey so entirely. The theme continues as Lionel recalls enduring bullying and insecurity for supposed physical and mental deficiencies. Despite self-improvement efforts, feeling of inadequacy persists. Worst is dependency on others completing tasks for him, leaving Lionel adrift and debilitated without direction. In this context, Lionel's adolescent enthusiasm manifests more ominously. Experimenting with lethal chemicals evokes control and power, otherwise absent in Lionel's self-concept under achievement pressures. Perhaps had Lionel found security internally earlier, anchoring identity on self-appraisal rather than meeting parental expectations, his son might have focused improving life rather than containing death. While Jeffrey was in jail, he stole razors. These razors were confiscated, which confirms Lionel's gut fears. Jeffrey could still spiral without safeguards against self-harm. Medications and monitoring aim to lift his sunken mood, locked down 23 hours a day. Visiting the gaunt inmate, Lionel gently prods, making the most of circumstances through spiritual growth while awaiting the cure-all pharmaceuticals. But Lionel is happy to see that there is a glimpse of Jeffrey improving on medications and envisioning productive prison life. Lionel is witnessing the humanity resurfacing in Jeffrey through remorse and spiritual awakening. He personally apologizes to a victim's family and sought religious counseling for inner peace and accountability. In childlike rediscovery, Jeffrey immersed in philosophical discussions with Lionel regarding evidence of divinely orchestrated creation they both reveled in. Lionel was finally seeing the glimmer of hope in Jeffrey that he had longed for. Jeffrey was flown back for formal sentencing and another killing. Lionel reassures his 10th son the brief court appearance simply closes procedural loose ends. Lionel knots the tie Jeffrey strangely cannot tie himself, his competence and independence clearly broken. But with Lionel's aid, he faces the hearing composed in clean suit and tie. He receives another charge, totaling 16 life sentences. Lionel continues to be ridiculed by the public. He deals with rejection in the workplace, public hostility tailing him despite attempts to remain inconspicuous, off the grid after trial publicity waned. He goes out for dinner, and their presence elicits taunts and refusal of service. At home, vicious acts of property damage spread fear. Hate and condemnation hound Lionel for the unforgivable sins of his son, over which he had no control. Only within the disturbing fan mail does some shared humanity exist. Strangers confessing chronic struggles, only Jeffrey's stark notoriety could draw out. There are the predictable religious salvations and romantic fantasies regarding the magnetic evil figure, but many unburdened raw frustrations echoing Lionel's own isolation, failing connections and inadequate achievements hounding self-worth as they had haunted him before. Perhaps these letter writers sought the very thing Lionel pursued in studying his son's damages and deficiencies so relentlessly following the trial. If Lionel continued past shame and regret to model self-love, he could reveal the light even Jeffrey's darkness desperately craved. Perhaps if Lionel found the courage to unpack his own psychological demons, he could have guided Jeffrey from similarly dark compulsions. Instead, he distracted himself with work, divorces, and superficial fixes while inner toxins festered. Now left with cleanup duty forever, Lionel grapples with genetic and parental responsibilities for birthing a monster despite sincere love. Early in November 1994, A letter arrives. Attorney Boyle faxes it to Lionel. It has been sent by the warden at Columbia Correctional Institution 5 days before. In it, the warden confirms Lionel's worst fears. Jeffrey Dahmer has been murdered by another inmate, Christopher Scarver, as the two have worked together. The weapon used was a metal bar, which Christopher had removed from one of the exercise machines in the gym. Jeffrey had been declared dead approximately 1 hour later. The warden assures Lionel that the prison officials have done all that they could to save his son. Jeff's death stuns Lionel, of course, and numbs him as well. For days afterwards, Lionel lives in a state of shock. He does not speak about it, nor does he discuss it with friends or other members of his family. Instead, Lionel goes through life in a kind of daze. He does his work, comes home, spends time with Dave when he is around, but in general, Lionel simply focuses on getting through the day. Lionel's minister who baptized Jeffrey gently scolds narrow perspectives, blind to boundless redemption possible for all. If society practiced that compassion preached, Lionel and Jeffrey's shared quest for the truth might have kept at bay the lies and delusions that consumed Jeffrey. And had Jeffrey's chaotic urges been met with support rather than punishment in younger days, he may have avoided defiant authority that deregulated sanity even further. Though some celebrated Jeffrey's violent prison death as deserved retribution, Lionel knows Jeffrey no longer wished harm, even to himself, and rediscovered purpose. And for the victims' families recently bridging understanding with Lionel through shared sorrow, they unilaterally forgive and begin mending wounds no execution could change. Lionel seeks answers for elaborate security's failure to protect a helpless inmate. Meanwhile, callous legal actions, adding indignity to injury, continue against Lionel's objections, like auctioning Jeffrey's murder tools for profit. The offenses display a strange societal psyche desperate to assign blame while ignoring collective responsibility. As Lionel's wrenching narrative concludes, the residual anguish persists years beyond Jeffrey's horrific downfall and eventual murder in prison. Legal battles and lawsuits continue plaguing Lionel, while a callous world moves on, indifferent to unhealed wounds. Jeffrey's longing for inner peace that prison's chaos denied. He hopes his tormented son rests in the eternal tranquility beyond earthly confines. Now let's take a look at where Lionel's mind was when he was protecting Jeffrey and the guilt he holds onto. After reading this book, there are two main points that stood out to me. First is that Lionel initially stated that he didn't support Jeffrey in any way. However, by the end of the book, we hear him visiting Jeffrey in jail and being his only support system. This is likely due to Lionel's guilt over potentially contributing to Jeffrey's issues. Despite the horrific actions, Lionel sees himself in Jeffrey. In recognizing their similarities, Lionel acknowledged their lost nurturing bond that he believes could have changed things. This connects him to an idealized version of his son. Like Jeffrey, Lionel struggled with violent urges and feeling of powerlessness, damaging his self-worth. He admits his emotional limitations likely impaired affection for his son. Lionel agonizes over passing on destructive tendencies while Jeffrey took it to extremes. Rather than abandoning his monstrous son, Lionel stuck by Jeffrey, seeing their inner demons as similar. Forgiving his son meant forgiving generational flaws in himself as well. The second point that stood out to me is Lionel blew occurrences out of proportion in order to blame himself and give meaning to his son's deviance. An example is when Lionel talked about saving little Jeffrey from thick mud. He imagined Jeffrey felt so relieved and grateful. Lionel thought Jeffrey believed his dad could protect him from anything bad. Back then, he pulled Jeffrey from danger, and now, Lionel beats himself up for not saving grown Jeffrey from addiction. And as we have heard, addiction is one of the main causes that Lionel believes to be Jeffrey's downfall. Another example is Lionel couldn't stop thinking about how moving a lot upset young Jeffrey's life. He blames uprooting Jeffrey repeatedly for making Jeffrey's problems and loneliness worse. By focusing on moments where he could have better parented or saved Jeffrey, Lionel convinced himself he is mostly at fault. This provides an illusion of control and avoids fully accepting Jeffrey's agency and culpability. Please remember to subscribe to the channel to receive automatic reminders of our weekly videos, and to also be reminded of our weekday live streams where we cover full trials and true crime stories. Also, if you want early access to ad-free and uncensored versions of all Wicked videos, feel free to become a channel member. Becoming a member will also give you access to exclusive emotes and badges. Thank you for watching, and join us next time when we explore the psychological maze of some of the most wicked people.